Oh, I'm John Fiddler. As you can tell, I'm not from these parts. I'm in California. I run my own consulting business, and I've been working alongside Ward at Menokin for seems like centuries.
As old as the house, no doubt, right?
Nearly.
And Ward, I think I'll give you a little intro here. So go for it.
Okay, Ward Booker, preservation architect. I've been working with John at Menokin for 10 years, but I've been working in the field for 50 years, and fairly recently joined the Historic Resources Committee here. And really, it's great to see a couple people from the West Coast of finding this interesting, and I hope to be able to share some preservation techniques with the attendees.
Great, thanks everyone for attending. So we'll do a quick recap on what's up in town. Our initiative for 2022 was to focus on technical preservation issues, which today is one of those focus meetings, preservation advocacy and preservation equity. So in both of those cases, we dealt with a number of issues last year and continuance into this year. The local group, the Commission for Historical and Architectural Preservation in Baltimore City, Eric Holcomb, the director there, is one of our members, and Johns Hopkins, the president of Baltimore Heritage, is also a member of our committee. So they usually give updates, but they're going to do it. I had them do it by email. So Eric reports that 5 new commissioners were sworn in to CHAP yesterday. They are Harry Spikes as chair. He's an MHT trustee and former staff of Representative Elijah Cummings. Peter Morrill, Preservation Maryland nominee. Nicole Battle, she's executive director of GEDCO, and I really do not know what that acronym stands for, but anyone here? GEDCO? No?
Something like the Greater Ecumenical Development Committee or something like that.
All right. She's also resident of a local historic district in the city. Catherine Good, who's a restoration architect, and Dr. Gary Rodwell, who's with the Coppin Heights Development Corporation. So those are the 5 new commission members. There is a Preservation Maryland connection here. I'm on the board of Preservation Maryland, along with Ward Booker, who's a new board member. I'm in my 6th year on the board, Preservation Maryland, so I'm cycling out and Ward is coming on. So welcome, Ward, and see you later.
I'll be calling you.
Yeah, okay.
For advice.
We'll still be involved. Another item, the Sarah Ann Street Proposed Historic District will be heard on May 10th with amended boundaries to include 319 and 321 North Carrollton Street. I'm not familiar with that district, but that's coming on. There's no status on the tax credit renewal, except that a mayoral committee will look at all tax credits and make recommendations for revisions. So they want to make the tax credit program, historic tax credit program, more accessible to lower income people and neighborhoods. So they want to create some CHAP light districts where they're slightly less restrictive and more encouraging to historic tax credit work. And the Department of Planning has begun its master plan process, and there will be many opportunities to participate. So that's the CHAP update, and we continue on. We were hoping to mobilize and meet with the local representatives to encourage support for all the preservation initiatives in the city as soon as they get the programs in place that we can advocate for. So we've been waiting for that development, and then the county council, or not the county council, the city council approval. So that's a quick update there. We, as part of our programming next month in May, we had hoped to focus on landscapes and view sheds. We're trying to take a look at some of the preservation briefs and get programming that supports maybe some of the lesser known and supported preservation briefs in the National Park Service program. In June, I had discussions with David Gleason, a local preservation architect who is active with the Fells Point historic group. He's the chair of the historic house there. His name escapes me suddenly. But he has offered to do a tour of Fells Point and the various types of historic masonry and masonry repair that's been done there over the years. And we've tentatively targeted that for June, the June meeting. And then in July, we were hoping to visit the National Park Service preservation facility out in Frederick and get a tour of that, to do some off-site touring. August we're off, and then we're in September, we're into Architecture Month, in October, and Doors Open programming and planning for next year. So that's a quick overview of the coming months. Does anyone else have anything to add? No? Okay, well, with that, Ward, we'll turn it over to you. Ward Bucher, as you heard, is on the Historic Resources Committee. That's at the top of his resume, the latest one I've seen.
Right.
As well as many other things. And Ward, I must, you're new to our committee and new to Baltimore. He purchased a historic house on Utah Place. And actually we had our Christmas party or holiday party there last December, and loved seeing it and loved hearing about his work there. You've also been on the Eastern Shore, involved in various groups there prior to Baltimore. So maybe you could fill us in briefly, and then we'll start.
Sure. So, yeah, my career, was when I was in school so long ago, brutalism was the latest style, and I didn't quite get that. And then I worked in New Orleans for a while, and things were, beginning to open my mind to old stuff, and worked in DC for a long time, early president of what was Don't Tear It Down, became DC Preservation League, and continued on for a while, moved out to the Eastern Shore in Oxford, and I was chairman of the Talbot County Historic Preservation Commission for 7 years out there, and now I've come to the big city, Baltimore, and enjoying the urban life. So if you can switch over to my screen, then be happy to get started with Menokin.
So I've been calling it the Menokin masonry presentation, and was corrected a couple of times.
Stone. Yeah.
It's stone, right? We're focusing on stone, a subset of masonry. So it's Menokin stone.
And we're particularly lucky to have John Fiddler here, who for a long time in England was, I'll probably get this incorrect, but in effect, head of maintaining the National Trust properties in England and various palaces and so forth, and a technology expert par excellence. And so he and I will focus on the preservation aspect of the Menokin stone. So are we now on can you see my screen with the?
No, so I just made you host so that you could do it. If you hit share screen, did you hit the green button on the bottom?
Okay, I'm hitting the share screen. And I think this is what I want to do. So do you see the title now?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay, so the presentation is actually being hosted by AIA Baltimore Historic Resources Committee. And we're going to be talking about the Menokin project, which is now called the Menokin Glass House Project, with these learning goals. And we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the property, why it's important, And then about the testing and investigations we did, and then how we actually restored a section of the wall to demonstrate the technology that we were proposing. So why was it important? Well, Francis Lightfoot Lee was one of the signers of Declaration of Independence. Hardly anyone's heard of him because he was a background kind of politician who actually got people to try and agree and compromise and so forth, rather than a Thomas Jefferson type of person. And Francis was a collateral branch of the famous Lee family of Virginia. That's his actual signature on the Declaration in the center. But he married Rebecca Taylor, the daughter of the Taylor family that owned Mount Airy in what is now Warsaw County in Virginia, about an hour north of Richmond by car. I don't know how long it took by horse. But as a wedding gift, Frank's father-in-law gave him a plantation, about 500 acres, and a stone house. Now, a really astonishing part of the story is that in the late 20th century, at Mount Airy, in the attic, they found the original drawings for the property. This is back in 1769. And you can see the main house was a Palladian style, almost square in plan, and had two outbuildings. On the left was an office building. On the right was a kitchen building. They weren't arranged the way it's shown on this plan for economy's sake, I suppose. And they were built very close to the way the drawing here. We think William Buckland was the designer. He went on to design and build lots of houses in Annapolis. So on the left, you see a close-up of the original plan. It had two chambers, a dining room, and a study. And on the right is a 1940 Habs drawing of how it was built. And you can see there's not much difference. The minor differences next to the stair hall, instead of building masonry walls, they built frame walls, so they were a lot thinner. They added a fireplace to the study, so they'd have some heat in winter. And everything else is virtually the same, except between the two chambers, there's a little thing there called a closet, which is not our meaning today for closet. It meant a small room, closed room, but it was also repurposed, if you want to call that, as a side entrance for the servants. So this is an early photograph of the front. You can see it was built quite close to the original drawings, and it has the original stone steps going up in a stone landing, and then this really hideous porch that was added on later. We're not quite sure when it was added on, but it was attached to the building before the building was stuccoed, or as the Brits say, rendered, around the decorative brickwork, or stonework, I should say. Now, Calder Loth is an architectural historian of some note in Virginia, and he has studied many pattern books, which were often used by the designers in our colonial period. And you can see here two from the book Vitruvius Scotius, Scottish Vitruvius, Vitruvius being the famous Roman architect who didn't leave us drawings, but left us a lot of descriptions. And you can see there's a number of different elements that are very similar to the pattern book, but not an exact copy. One of the interesting things is that the exterior masonry walls are stone and the interior walls are brick. And they built the stone walls first, just a shell, and then infilled the brick walls. And you can see the stone walls had these really large mortar joints, in part because the stones were so irregular. And the brickwork, wasn't exactly perfectly level, but it was all covered with plaster, so no one noticed at the time. This is a view in the attic of the northeast corner, which is one of the portions of the building that is still fairly extant together. That diagonal beam is called a dragon beam, which ties the corners together, and you're looking on the top of some hand split lath that was originally there. And those are the original sheathing boards, but originally it was skip sheathing with spaces between the boards, and later infilled because they replaced the wood shingles with metal shingles. So this is an axiometric view of what was extant in terms of the stonework and masonry about 15 years ago, and some conjectural infill of the timbers which had fallen. On the right, you can see one of the things is that the exterior walls get thinner as they go up, as you expect. They're as wide as 4 feet at the basement level, and they shrink as they go up and are about 2 feet thick at the top. So these are massive thick walls. Here's another early photograph. On the left, you can see the office wing that was still together, and a picket fence. So there was this courtyard enclosure. There were 2 ways of approaching the house. From the east side to this is actually the north facade. And then on the south, there was a terrace that stepped down to the creek behind the building. However, over the years, they weren't too kind to the building, weather and fallen trees. The last time we think this was occupied was in 1942, perhaps. It had passed down in the family, but all through the matrilineal line. So the Lees left the house to a daughter who passed on to her daughter, and so forth. And you can see on the left is the northeast corner, somewhat intact. The 2 chimney stacks are still together, but much of the other stonework had collapsed and fallen. The concept that was developed was to restore and rebuild portions of the stonework, but infill the larger missing parts with glass. And the current design architect is Machado Sabelli Associates out of Boston, with Encore Sustainable Architect, my firm, is the historical architect, and John Fiddler is our technology consultant. And I'll talk a little bit at the end. There's a very large team of people working on it. So what does one do with a pile of stones? This is Martin King, an early volunteer and neighbor, working away on the stones over time. A lot of people helped on this. And you can see there's a shed that was built over the building to protect it from further degradation. So with a lot of efforts, the stones were sorted. The small rubble stones were put in bins. The cut stones were all put on pallets, and with an attempt to identify where they come from. And this is actually 3 preservation interns on a summer program that helped to catalog and sort the stones. So here are 2 large stones that if you learn nothing else from this preservation, look at the stainless steel tags, because that's what has stood the test of time. Magic marker on cloth or paper or any other type of label isn't going to last over time. So each tag has a unique number. It really doesn't matter what the number is, because each one gets entered in a database that has the size and shape and so forth of each stone, which helped in the sorting and of the stones. So one of the unique things we did here is we used the 1940 head drawings of the elevations to print scrims at full size. So at the 46-foot wide front elevation was printed with a full-size plan. And then we actually used that to put the stones on the scrim to figure out which ones belonged here. Here you see the summer intern with her OSHA required protective gear, sorting stones and putting them in place. And then on the left, you can see here's a number of coins that we figured out where they came from. And on the right, a window surround. They had some, unusual shapes they used. This was way out in the country at the time, and not a team of skilled mason like you might find in an urban area. So it was interesting to figure out how they had actually put the building together. In addition to stacking things kind of horizontally, we had to stack them vertically to see what went together. So these are some corner blocks. The middle block is what we call a water table, where the building got a little bit smaller. And one of the things we looked at also is these existing walls. They weren't vertical. The concept is that the earth pressure on the basement level move the basement walls in a little bit, and ending up with a somewhat bowed shape to the building. Some other things we had to deal with was some early interventions. Here in the southwest corner, a grouting strategy was to put very hard cementitious grout into the building. Wasn't well protected from dripping and so forth. We actually ended up having to jackhammer this apart. Unfortunately, we couldn't separate it. So again, remember the preservation mantra: do reversible work, do work that can be undone in the future if there's a reason to do that. Another thing we were dealing with is the really poor quality of the stone. It was an ironstone, sandstone with a lot of ferric oxide in it, and but it also had a lot of clay intrusions in kind of layers. And these holes are actually eaten in by bees. There are masonry bees like there are carpentry bees, and you can see the lighter colored stone was really soft, and that's where they put the holes and put the larvae inside. So one of the things, and this was a search led by John Fiddler, of trying to find either a matching stone that we could use to replicate broken or missing parts, or the original source of the ironstone. So this is actually a geology class that's studying the building, and then they searched around the county they found a number of outcroppings, but unfortunately nothing of significant size that we could actually cut new blocks out of. But John also searched around the world to see if we could find something that was matching, and we came up dry. So we're going to talk about this that you're looking at. This is the northwest corner, and we use this as a test of our restoration techniques. One thing I want to point out, can you see my cursor as I move it around?
Yes.
Not. No, I guess
Yes.
not.
Yes.
Okay, so on the right side, there are these large cut stone blocks that were the face stones. On the inside were large rubble stones. And in between were small stones put in with a low strength mortar. What there is not are any what they call bond stones, any stones large enough to bridge across. So there's no physical connection between the inside and the outside faces of the building. And that's part of the reason that the building was structurally unstable. So we had to take up the stones that had not already been moved. The archaeologist got involved, and you can see lying down some of the larger face stones, and they're not bonded really to the rubble stone infill. The archaeologist did excavate before we just started work on this corner. One interesting thing was they found a level of flat paving stones at the what we think was the original finished grade level that was sort of like a path around the building. My theory is that was used to catch the drips off the eaves because there were no gutters there. So the mortar inside, you can see this is a fresh face of the mortar, quite light in color because it hadn't been exposed to the sun or dirt and so forth. And it's also, you can see that it has this really nice, wonderful, rough texture, but it has a number of stones that are mixed in with it to fill up the joints. And if those are pushed into the wet mortar, they're called galleting. And John perhaps can comment on whether these were mixed in as they put in the mortar or added later. So one of the things we did was some testing with actually two different firms of the mortar itself to see what its composition was. And primarily it was quicklime made from burning shells, calcium oxide, and sand, mostly silica. And the components, you can see each column is a different location, and it was fairly uniform. We tested it by the percentage of dry mass, which is a good way to also recreate the new mortar. And it tended to be approximately 1 part of the quicklime to 3 parts of the sand. But you'll see there were some anomalies. Look at the mortar F1, it was almost 1-to-1 kind of ratio. So, and it also had some, in addition to the actual lime, some chips of shell involved in it. Replicating that was a little bit of a problem because now in Maryland you have to take oyster shells and put them back in the water. This property is quite close to the Rappahannock River and is on a creek itself. So the new mix primarily was natural hydraulic lime, actually imported from France, and sand. So one of the things we had to do was find, well, what was the best sand to mix it with. On the left, you can see is a river bank sand, and on the right is a finer sand that sometimes called play sand. And so we looked at a number of different mixtures to try and get the right texture and the right color. And so here you see 3 different samples put together, and no surprise, but the river sand came up with the color and texture that was closest to those 2 little chunks of samples there. So here I am measuring with the old-fashioned way of rulers and sketching. This is a large jamstone at the basement entrance. But because of the complex nature of this building, and nothing is really vertical or horizontal anymore, we did a laser scan of the building. On the left, you'll see there's a target. They took on a tripod the laser scanning in each different space, and the targets allowed us to tie them back together so they could have one composite view. And then we could take elevation, sections, plans, whatever we wanted there. And that worked out really quite well. In addition to which, firm GBG did testing with both ground penetrating radar to find voids like flues in chimneys, or else just hollow spots where perhaps water had created voids. And we also did searching with magnetometers to look for hidden iron components within the building. So one of the things that we had to establish is, what's a reference point? So we chose the top of the water table stone at the northeast corner. That was the most intact corner. And then we used that with surveyors to establish the other three corners, because the other three corners all had to be rebuilt. And the surveyors established batter boards, which were then used to establish both the height and the outside perimeter of our reference points. So back to the northwest corner, a little clearer picture here after the archaeologists were finished. And I think you can clearly see the cut stones on the right side of the wall, the rubble stones on the left, and little stones and lots of little debris inside. So surprisingly, it turned out the best way to get rid of the debris was to vacuum it out. And you can see here a workman actually vacuuming out that stuff. It was so lacking in bond that it really didn't cling to the stones. And you can see here is the hole that they cleaned out went down a couple of feet, and there was a substantial amount of voids. This is the pile they took out of that corner of loose debris, which was really quite astonishing to me. So to fill that void back up, we installed grouts. And so I don't think I mentioned this, but we really had two phases to this project in terms of the masonry. One is restoring walls in place, and the other is rebuilding walls where the stones had fallen out of place. So here's a workman putting in modeling clay to fill up gaps around the outside of the building. And then they're washing the inside, really low pressure wash. The water's coming out of that red tank with a little hand pump on the top. But to get rid of all this debris, and you can see they've left some holes so the water can flow out. Then after the washing, they put these little valves in the holes so that when they put the grout in, it could fill up the grout to the lowest level. When it reached there, they would close off the valves and then let it go to the next level. And this way they avoided air pockets in the wall as they filled it up with the grout. Here's a workman doing another part of our strategy, which is drilling holes into the back of the outside stones. And into those holes, we put Helifix anchors. You can see they're spiral stainless steel anchors. The spiral helps both attach the stone, the anchor into the hole in the stone, but also helps grip the mortar as we fill up the voids. The stones, the masons called them coconut, these small stones. They would wash each one, get all the debris off. They would soak them as they were working to keep them from sucking the moisture out of the mortar. And then, put them all in place and make sure that the voids were full. So here you see that grout, filling up the walls. Then they pack them with the smaller stones, all set in mortar. So one of the techniques to tie the different parts of the wall together was to use a stainless steel mesh, 2-inch by 2-inch mesh. And we put this in courses once we got above the grouting level. And you can see the Helifix anchors are wrapped around intersections of the grid so that this would tie the outside faces of the wall together. An additional method was cramps, which were iron rods that sort of like a staple before it gets put on the paper, but two short vertical legs put into holes into the stone to tie them together horizontally. And then once we get up to a level, you can see a number of the cramps in place here, both diagonally and both directions around the corner to keep the faces tied together. They're stainless steel bars, of course, so that they won't rust. So an additional technique that had to wait was putting in Syntec anchors. And we had to wait because it takes about 60 days or more for the natural hydraulic lime to cure enough so that we can drill holes in it. So these anchors are small diameter, hollow, stainless steel tubes with a lot of holes in them. And then they're wrapped with a nylon sock. They're inserted in the holes, which in some cases are 23 feet long at corners, and then filled with grout to grab onto the stone. So here is a wall with each orange dot where we're going to drill. So the basic pattern is a square with a dot in the middle. But of course, it had to be adjusted because some of the stones, well, they all were regular, but we always had to drill in a solid part of a stone. So it was a fair amount of art to figure out exactly where we were going to end up drilling these holes. There's the drill machine. It's basically like a hollow pipe with a diamond cutting edge on it, set up and slowly inserted into the stone and cutting away. And so here's, you can see there's the orange dot. It has cut this core out of the outside. These later get inserted with a mortar that matches the stone color, and they're virtually invisible. Now, in our case, of course, all of these holes were cut from the outside so that the earth would cover up the work in any event, so they weren't going to be visible. So here's a workman putting a nozzle and injecting the grout into the end of the tube that's in the wall. So we're going to talk about a different repair technique. How do you fix broken stones? Well, Hank Handler, a creative guy working on the job, came up with this technique that in this stone, he drilled 3 vertical holes and put magic markers in them. He then took the other piece of stone and set it on top, and it made marks exactly aligned with the holes. So he cut the holes in both stones, both faces of the stone. And then all thread, stainless steel all thread, gets inserted in the stone and set with epoxy. And then epoxy is put on the other piece, and the stone is put back together. The joints eventually were filled with a mortar that fairly closely matched the color of the stone. We didn't try to make them look invisible joints, but not be prominent. So here is, I think this is Hank himself, adjusting stones, trying to find the very right ones to turn the corner. One of the techniques that John brought to the project was a planning frame where the plastic in a frame, was held up against the stone, and the outlines were drawn, and then we could disassemble the wall and use this to reassemble things in the right location. Interestingly, though, as the project developed, the technique changed, and they switched to doing digital photographs blown up to full size for a more accurate view of exactly how to place the stone. And this is that wall that they were working on, and you can see that you have the infill work and then the jointing at the outside. This isn't the finished product, though. So on the right is an original wall without the stucco on it, and you'll see in some locations the original bird's beak mortar jointing with a pointed profile was still in place. And so that's what we replicated in the rebuilt work. One of the decisions that have been made, I mentioned earlier, the difficulty of getting the shells, the small pieces of shells and other things. So we did use that, them in the pointing mortar to get as accurate as possible, color and texture and so forth, but not in the mortar in the middle of the wall. So here is that corner as the completion of this test at the beginning. Then we continued on upward. This is Tim Winther, head mason, with his pet rock on a leash. But we continued on dismantling as we needed to and rebuilding other walls. And that's the current situation of where we are. We're building 2 major walls up to the eave of the house. And we will, I think next week, be starting to put in some of the steel framework to hold up the glass. So you can see here we have this huge team of people working on the project, doing a lot of different pieces of the puzzle here, working together, and happy to, if you want the names of any of these consultants, let me know. But thank you for attending the talk, and this is the link if you want to get AIA credit for attending the program. And I am happy to answer any questions anyone may have.
Great, great. Thank you, Ward. That was tremendously interesting. I'll start with a question. How long did it take to build that corner?
Well, it took essentially a summer to do that. In part, one of the things that took the longest was they had to excavate, the archaeologists had to excavate a builder's trench that was 3 feet away from the wall, and then stepped up down to the bottom of the wall so they could do the work. So that was, as you can imagine, a fairly slow process. And they were also testing out these different techniques. I'll give you an example. One of the things we thought we were going to use is something like cramps or other reinforcing bars within the wall. And that turned out to not be practical because the stones are just so irregular. They weren't, we couldn't do regular coursing as you would in a brick wall or a new masonry wall. So we were trying out different kind of techniques and trying to figure out which worked the best.
Anyone else have a question to throw in there?
I'm going to plead ignorance, but the oyster shells have to return to the river. Is that what you said?
Yeah, in Maryland, the law is that you can't use oyster shells and, for example, put them on your walk or something. They have to, because they call them the spats, the little eggs of the oyster shells only like to attach to oysters shells. So what they do now is, if from restaurants and other places, when the used oyster shells get put back into the water on what they call oyster bars, so that they can grow more oysters. So you're actually not allowed to take them and crush them and put them in your building.
So they were originally in the original mortar and you
Well,
used them.
that's where the lime came from.
That's
they
where
would-
the lime came from.
They
Okay.
would actually burn the oyster shells, and John may want to address this in some more detail.
Yeah, it's not necessarily the case that they went out fishing for oysters and then burnt the lime. Geologically, there are what's called raised beds from previous sea levels. And so in parts of Virginia, they exist, and you can just shovel the shells out of banks of rivers. Where the island of Barbados in the Caribbean is about 5 or 6 oyster beds high across the entire island. And so that exists on mainland coasts as well. The rules about the oysters are for the whole northeastern seaboard down to Virginia, but Georgia refused to sign the treaty. So we smuggled oysters in from oyster bars in Georgia. And of course, the contractor had to wash all the salt off the oyster shells and then crush them to the consistency that we needed to get the texture back into the, very pure air lime mortar that now comes from a manufacturing process that's really for food refining, and it's too refined. And then get them all to mix together. We did look at big suppliers of oyster shells in the States, but they're all on the West Coast in Petaluma, California. And that's a different kind of oyster. They're blue-black, very small and very weak in their structure. And who knew they're used to put into chicken feed. And Petaluma is the chicken capital of California. So there are vast mountains of gray-blue oyster shell available for anybody in California, but that's of no use to this project because we needed very strong, high calcium lime Atlantic oyster for the project.
Or they have different crabs there too.
Yeah,
Not
absolutely.
nearly as good. You said that there were both iron and clay inclusions in the stone.
Yeah.
Did you do anything to remediate those?
No, I mean, it's a natural occurring product. Geologically speaking, these beds are on the top of the escarpment or plateau on the side of the Rappahannock River. And our guess is that when Mount Airy was built, they cleaned off, that's the kind of mothership of all plantations along this part of Virginia. And we reckon that they took all the best, deepest and strongest stones for that project. And then the son-in-law got all the crap that was left for his project. So it's a ferruginous sandstone. It's bound by the iron oxides and with these clay beds, which are not very regular in the way they're stratified. So it makes it extremely difficult to cut freestone out of them. And so that explains why the front and back facades of this building have got dressed ashlar stonework, and the sides are random rubble above the water table level, and apart from the dressings around windows and doors.
I have a question on, I guess, the preservation kind of technologies. When you first started the project versus, as things improve in the course of the years, what did you switch or did you switch techniques because new things are coming into play? And my question specifically is, for example, with laser scanning, I had this, I don't even know if it exists or not, but would it have been possible to have an entire, scanning it to essentially identify at least the, whatever remains there in terms of the outside cut stone, and categorize it in the digital world, and then use that information to, recreate, or is that not possible?
Well, we did quite an extensive research that way, and we actually drew some elevations and placed stones in them to the extent we could. We were a bit hampered by the existing walls, had a fair amount of stucco still in place on them. And when they did the Habs drawings, almost all the building had stucco on it. So we didn't have a easy early reference there. And there, it involved a fair amount of conjecture because the stones were falling. Now, when the stones were removed, once the archaeologists got involved, they did record where they found each stone. So we would know, that it was found on the outside of the south face. So, of course, it should belong there. But there were quite a few stones. And we have been able to, relocate quite a few of them. But it certainly, had we had an early laser scanner without stucco, it quite likely would have been possible. We have used for some details and so forth of how it was originally constructed, both the Habs drawings and the Habs photographs, which were very useful in the particular, like the water table stones and enframelents of windows and so forth.
The other issue, which I think Ward's alluded to, is that, we're not the first people to play with this amazing structure. There were previous teams since the collapse that were involved in early parts of the rescue. And in fact, we discovered there were 2 previous sets of photogrammetric drawings for the site. Some converted to rudimentary CAD drawings, but we could never find the original data. The data is so ephemeral in a sense. The management of the property, the people involved, the archives, all those things, they've changed. Other companies got hired, others, everyone forgot about certain things. So, we were frustrated. We couldn't use earlier records in sufficient detail to do what we needed to do. And of course, we weren't there when the original collapse took place or when the original rescue started with basically rescue salvage and propping walls to stop them collapsing. And the archaeologists that were hired, sound archaeologists as they are, they had very little experience of above ground archaeology. So, and certainly not of architectural details. So things got labeled and measured and drawn, but they didn't help us very much on where they lived on the building. And that's why we went for the brilliant idea of the scrim, because that was good PR locally, got in all the newspapers, got students involved. It was really simple then to go out and say, well, we need something that goes in this corner. What is it? What's the shape and does it fit there?
Right.
When was the collapse?
Well, it started, I believe, in 1964 when a large tree fell on a corner. And then it was a progressive thing, as you can imagine, that it got worse and worse. But it was fascinating to people as a ruin. It actually is a National Historic Landmark as a ruin, not as a building. And again, that was one of the I think driving things about the glass house concept was we weren't really wanting to restore it as a building. And the other factor was kind of, the idea of the draw. If we had restored it as it was, and down the road is the Stratford Hall, which is this huge mansion with people in the colonial costumes and events and tours and stuff, who would come to Menokin to see that? So the foundation, I think, wisely thought that, okay, our mission is more an educational one, and that the collapse is part of the history, and they focused on also the whole site itself. How were enslaved people treated? Where were they located? Where were the rolling roads? How was the terraces located, and which have all been overgrown with trees and over hundreds of years, and so forth. So it is a sort of an interesting and complex environment that we're working in.
Ward, what was your interaction with the design architect, Machado Silvetti?
Well, so I came on board about 10 years ago to work on the historic structure report. The concept had been around. A fellow by the name of Charles Phillips was an architect who first came up with the idea, although he didn't have the technology and staff and so forth to carry it forward. But so I started on the project with the same time Machado and Silvetti did, and they are notable for doing some very interesting glass structures in Saudi Arabia and Dubai and other places, and they very much are focused on the aesthetics of property. But also there was a lot of concerns. Well, if this is an unconditioned building, how will it function? How will it just be a solar furnace, when the sun hits it? And, how does all that work? How do we, deal with all these different elements and the interaction between them? So my role has been more to say, well, how are we going to restore the wood? And, we have like a huge summer beam of which we have about 6 feet of it left. And, what do we do with that? What do we do with the rotten ends of the joists? And to, keep the awareness of the historical approach. And, we we continue to deal with interesting questions from, as you can imagine, the foundation kind of has rotating board members. And recently one said, well, we need handicap access to the basement. How will we get a ramp in there? And I said, well, okay, then we can take out the historic stone steps and put in a ramp. But, the entrance is only 5 feet, 6 inches high to the basement. So I don't think we're going to make the ADA code. And so instead, yes, we'll have tours. It'll go down the, we're going to build stainless steel steps over the original steps, which are unsafe. And people will wear hard hats. Very low tech solution to some of the low headroom problems.
Any other questions in-house or on the board there? Great. Well, I guess we're at about 6:10, so we can wrap if give you one more chance. Anything going to keep you awake tonight? No.
And if any, midnight thoughts occur to you, please contact me in the morning.
2 a.m. That's right.
And we'll be happy to answer them. Or John, John is a fabulous resource for the technology aspect. So, and has been very helpful to me and others over the years. So,
I'm three hours behind you guys. So,
yeah, you're available.
Yeah.
So we'll mention one more time. We actually have a CEU HSW credit available. So please, everyone, take advantage of that. Those are hard to come by. We hope to do more. So very good. With that, how to best do that, Margaret? Do we?
I've dropped it in the chat twice now.
But how do you get it out of the chat?
They click it.
But once we close down,
How do we
right?
get it?
If you're not on it now, like if you're not on a computer now, just send me an email,
Okay.
mstella@aiabalt.com, and I will send it to you to fill out so we can get credit.
Very good. Thank you. And again, thanks to all. Ward, thank you. And John, thank you for your contributions. And thanks for joining us from the West Coast. And we hope to see you next time. You're all are welcome.
All right, thanks.
Thanks,
for
guys.
hosting.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay. That's over.